There have been rumours circulating for months at this point that Nintendo are getting ready to unleash an improved model of the incredibly successful Nintendo Switch. Many credible sources report that this new Switch, dubbed Switch Pro, will feature an OLED screen as distinct from its current LCD display and take advantage of Nvidia's excellent DLSS and AI upscaling technique to make games appear like they are being rendered in 4K when they actually aren't. I'd like to pose the question, however, if this is a good idea. Should Nintendo bother producing a Pro model of their current hardware? Should they release an outright sequel to their hardware a la Wii to Wii U, or should they drop the Switch branding altogether and go for something new? Let's discuss. First, let's look at what Nintendo have done in the past. See first the Nintendo Game Boy line of systems. The original black and white Game Boy was a resounding success. The world was swept up in a Game Boy induced fever, and that success was only amplified by its revision, the Game Boy Color. This was a revision that improved upon the original and one that was a resounding sales success. Apart from the Color variant, Nintendo also manufactured two other versions of the original Game Boy, the Game Boy Light and the Game Boy Pocket. Altogether, the original Game Boy and its Color variant sold 118 million units. The successor to the Game Boy Advance, had three revisions to it. There was the original Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Advance SP, and the Game Boy Micro. Despite having three revisions, the Game Boy Advance sold 80 million units, 40 million less than its predecessor. It isn't hard to see why. By this point, there were 7 different versions of the Game Boy, including revisions for sale, each with similar sounding names. How was a layman to know the difference between a Game Boy Micro and a Game Boy Pocket? Or how could an everyman tell the difference between a Game Boy Advance SP and a Game Boy Color? Nintendo, quite simply, oversaturated the market with too many Game Boys to the point of diminishing returns. While the Game Boy Advance line sold well, that isn't the point. It sold worse. Clearly, in this case, too many revisions hurt Nintendo. Its revisions oversaturated the market and ended up hurting the brand in the long term. To prove this point, look at the sales of the successor to the GBA, the Nintendo DS line. Nintendo DS, DSi, Lite and XL sold 152 million units worldwide. This is almost double the total sales of the Game Boy Advance and 30 million more than the original Game Boy. Clearly the DS shows that no, people didn't jump off the Game Boy bandwagon because it was a new Nintendo. They jumped off because there was an oversaturation of Game Boys. The DS line was so successful because it was revolutionary, bold, and crucially, new. Nintendo have a habit of oversaturating the market with their handhelds, as evidenced by the successor to the DS, the 3DS. Initially, the 3DS sold abysmally. It was only after a price cut that the system recovered any semblance of dignity, and even then, it ended its life having sold 76 million units. That is an astronomical drop-off from the DS. Much like the DS, there were far too many variants. There was the 3DS, the 3DS XL, the 2DS, the new 2DS XL, the new 3DS, and the new 3DS XL. Add to that the variants of the original DS and you have an absolute dearth of products branded DS. Quite plainly, Nintendo once again oversaturated the market with handhelds branded as DS, to such an extent that there was a drop-off of near 50% from the DS to the 3DS. And this pattern isn't just limited to Nintendo's handheld department. Take a look at the Wii, which shipped 100 million units. Nintendo released a bevy of Nintendo Wii accessories with names like Wii Fit, Wii Music, Wii Sports, Wii Party. The Wii U, its successor, drowned in a market once again oversaturated by Wii products and failed as a result. People presumed it was an add-on to Wii or an inconsequential accessory. One can easily imagine a mother saying, "Why would we need a Wii U if we already have a Wii?" Likewise, a mother might say, "Why would we need a Game Boy Advance if we have a Game Boy? What is a 3DS but a DS, which we own many of, with a 3D effect that we don't really care about?" The problem with oversaturating a market is that people are less and less likely to care when you release a successor. Finally, take a look at the Switch. The Wii U floundered and the 3DS struggled, and while not a failure, was a substantial drop-off from the heights of the DS era. The Nintendo Switch outsold the Wii U in its first year and passed the 3DS in its third year. Only time will tell if it outsells the DS, but it's more than likely that it will surpass the Wii. Once again, Nintendo oversaturated the Wii and DS brand to such an extent that they needed to abandon the branding altogether and start afresh with Switch. So back to the topic of discussion, should Nintendo release a Switch Pro, a Switch XL, or a new Switch? From what I can gather, it should be a resounding no, no, and no. They've already released a second SKU of the Switch in the Switch Lite. This Switch Lite makes sense. It fills the hole of a cheap portable for kids that the 3DS vacated. A supercharged Switch, however, that will only cheapen the hype for the inevitable Switch 2. In my humble, meaningless, uncultured opinion, Nintendo should not oversaturate the market with Switch branded hardware. If they plan to follow the normal cyclical generational console format, wherein you release a system and wait 5 to 6-ish years before releasing its successor, they absolutely should not release a Switch Pro. They would only be oversaturating their own market, dooming the eventual Switch 2. However, I haven't mentioned the possibility that Nintendo will abandon the cyclical generational format in general. Nintendo Switch could easily become Nintendo's iPhone. What I mean by this is that Nintendo would look to release a new Nintendo Switch every year or every second year, constantly iterating the hardware. This would be an excellent move on their part. Every Switch game would work with every Switch, meaning they'd never have to start a new console generation from zero ever again. Like iPhones with the App Store, Switches would come with a massive library of software from day dot. What's more, this would mean that players aren't being prohibited from playing the newest games. Much like phones, if a new game comes out, you can still download it on a 3-year-old phone, albeit with compromises. Starting from zero every 4 to 5 years seems silly when you take a step back and look at things logically. Why abandon an audience you just spent 6 valuable years cultivating? It's simply nonsensical. Nintendo have traditionally suffered at the expense of the console generation. By the Wii, they have seen a decline in sales each and every time they release a successor to their latest home console. Likewise with its handhelds. Abandoning the generational philosophy would serve them well. If they are changing tact, and the Switch Pro, as is being dubbed, is the first in a long line of iPhone-esque iterations, then I would say that yes, such a product would be a good idea. The difference between consoles and iPhones is that for a console to be considered successful, it needs to beat or match the sales of its predecessor. If it doesn't, if your previous hardware sold better or your opposition's hardware sold better, then your newest generation will be seen as a drop-off, a net loss of players. With an iPhone, you're buying into an ecosystem. Apple doesn't care if the iPhone 8 sells less than the iPhone 7. As long as they have people inside their ecosystem, they're making money. A net drop-off of users is meaningless. People will still be using iTunes or the App Store on their older phones. This is the direction Nintendo should go. Forget about generations, blur the lines. Focus on getting people into your ecosystem first and foremost. Focus on building up one massive interconnected ecosystem for years to come, rather than tearing everything down and starting from scratch in 6 years. Should Nintendo choose to stick with the cyclical model of consoles, then a Switch Pro would be, from what research I've done, a bad idea. It will only oversaturate the market at the expense of the Switch 2. Evidence and logic would suggest that Nintendo should follow in Apple's footsteps, but, well, Nintendo don't always seem to operate on logic. Only time will tell. Thanks for watching, subscribe if you're new, and leave the video a like if you did. Until next time.